And joining us now to talk about the Orlando attack from a national security perspective is former Homeland Security Advisor to President George Bush, Fran Townsend, and former Deputy CIA Director and CBS News Senior Security Contributor Michael Morell. Michael, let me start with you. Put this event in context with the larger war against terrorism and ISIS.
So I think the best way, John, to do that is to talk about the CIA Director's testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee on Thursday, which I think is the most candid, accurate statement we've heard from an administration official. John said three things. One is that despite the success we've had in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, the terrorist capability of ISIS overseas has not yet been degraded. That was number one. Number two, the terrorist threat is going to get worse before it gets better, because as we put pressure on ISIS in Iraq and Syria, all those Westerners who went to fight there are going to come home, right? And they're going to think about conducting attacks. And three, it's not just about Iraq and Syria anymore in terms of defeating ISIS. It's now about defeating them wherever they've spread in the world, in particular to Libya now.
Fran, when you look at this event, it seems that the shooter in this case declared allegiance, but at the day of the attack. How much of a connection do you see between ISIS and this massacre?
Well, let's be honest. He's at various points, we now know he claimed allegiance to ISIS just before the attack, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah, which is a Shia extremist group, right? And so it's not clear. He clearly was mentally ill, and what his ties are have not been made clear yet. One of the things we know that investigators are looking at are his social media. They've not made that public. That may shed some light. We know that there are ongoing investigations overseas looking at his travel to Saudi Arabia on Hajj, and so I think it remains to be seen whether or not he had any direct ties to ISIS or any terrorist group.
So, Mike, if this is a person who just claimed allegiance at the 11th hour, does that have national security implications? Which is, there's obviously a call from the electorate for a response.
Right.
We have in this debate seen some people argue that the response creates more problems. In some of the, Omar Mateen at one point talked about what the United States was doing. So he wasn't saying, I support ISIS because of their desires about a caliphate. He was angry at the U.S. counterterrorism efforts. Right. So is there a national security implication of the way this is responded to?
So I think that it's, I think he was a lone wolf. I think we're going to find out that he was not directed, right? So I think he was a lone wolf. Self-radicalized, talked to not very many people about his views, right? It's very difficult for intelligence and law enforcement to find, to discover, and to disrupt lone wolves, right? So we really need the help of the community, of the family and friends to give us warnings, right, about these kind of people. That's the way you have to deal with it. And when you start talking about broad surveillance against Muslims, when you start talking about going into mosques, when you start talking about shutting down mosques, you make it more difficult for the Muslim community to want to reach out and have a relationship with law enforcement.
Fran, the Attorney General mentioned that because they have limited access to online behavior, it would be hard to have seen the self-radicalization that went on. But if self-radicalization is what happened between when the FBI stopped its looking into Mr. Mateen, do there need to be some new tools to capture the self-radicalization that happens with lone wolves?
Absolutely. So the Attorney General has what's called domestic investigation operational guidelines that apply. What it basically does is the internal regulations of the Justice Department about how the FBI conducts its investigations within the law. And so they need to review those guidelines to decide, are they too restrictive? So I'll give you an example, John. I have a social media account, and any journalist could follow it and sort of report on it because I make those statements public. The AG's guidelines restrict when and how the FBI can look at that. And the question is, if when we find out, we learn more about what he was posting on Facebook and social media, there may have been clues to his self-radicalization, the cycle of violence and how he was getting closer to being violent. maybe if we relook at those guidelines and loosen those guidelines and allow the FBI access to that sooner, it's yet another fact that they can factor in as they make those assessments.
Mike, in the battle against ISIS overseas, there's been developments in Fallujah. Explain what they mean. How much do they mean in this battle?
So it's essentially, the fight for Fallujah is essentially over. There's some cleanup operations that need to be done. There's still some ISIS fighters in Fallujah, but it's basically over. I think it's important strategically and tactically. Strategically, Fallujah was the first city to fall to ISIS, so taking it back sends an important message. Tactically, it was the location from where the ISIS suicide bombers were leaving to go to Baghdad to conduct really the hundreds of attacks that have taken place there. So tactically, it's important to take that city away from them because it was so close to Baghdad. There are now a number of cities between Fallujah and Mosul, and they're going to have to take each one of those in succession. So we're probably still months away from Fallujah, from Mosul, but this is certainly an important step.
Is there any way in which it has, it can degrade the kind of allure of the Islamic State that a lone wolf might be attracted to?
So I think that is part of our messaging, right? That needs to be part of our messaging about they've lost now 50% of their caliphate in both Iraq and Syria. That is a message we should be getting out, and our partners should be getting out for that exact purpose.
Fran, the last question to you. It used to be when we talked about terrorism in the United States, we talked about bombs. Now, it seems to me, at least in the last two, there have been semi-automatic weapons used. Is that a notable shift? Is it an important shift? How do you read that?
You know, Adam Gaddan, an al-Qaeda member, called for the use of guns and terrorist attacks going back almost 10 years ago. And really, we've seen San Bernardino and we've seen Orlando. I'm concerned that we're going to see more of these types of attacks. And I think that as we look at going forward, we've got to look at how can we reduce the lethality of these attacks? How can we interrupt the cycle of violence? And one of the things we've got to consider, among many things, is whether or not that the ban on assault weapons, AR-15s, the larger size ammunition clips is a piece to a larger puzzle. It won't stop it. We've seen Oslo, we've seen in countries, Paris, Brussels, where they get weapons if they want them. It's not the only answer, but reducing the lethality is important and we ought to look at it.
All right, Fran and Mike, thank you so much. We'll be back in a moment to talk about the week in politics.